My daughter asked me not to attend her wedding. My father-in-law has always been more of a dad than you, she said. I stayed silent. During the ceremony, the priest said, I can't proceed with this wedding. The truth must be told. All the guests froze. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I'm 61 years old, and I thought I'd experienced every kind of heartbreak life could throw at me. I was wrong. Standing in Paula's pristine kitchen, surrounded by wedding flowers and gift boxes, I watched my only daughter arrange white roses with mechanical precision. Her back was turned to me, but I could feel the tension radiating from her shoulders. Dad, we need to talk, she said without looking at me. Those 5 words made my stomach drop. I set down the coffee mug she'd reluctantly offered me. What's on your mind, sweetheart? Paula finally turned around, and the coldness in her eyes hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't my little girl anymore. This was a 32-year-old woman who looked at me like I was a stranger she barely tolerated. I don't want you at my wedding tomorrow. The words hung in the air between us. I must have heard her wrong. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I said. Her voice was steady, clinical. You don't belong there. Harold has been more of a father to me than you ever were. Harold, Christian's father. The man who'd swooped into our lives 3 years ago when Paula started dating his son. The successful businessman who owned half the commercial real estate in town, who took Paula shopping and called her his daughter, who somehow managed to be everything I apparently wasn't. I felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. Paula, I know I wasn't perfect, but I did my best. After your mother died, I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. I never missed a birthday, never forgot a school play. You were always working, she cut me off, her voice rising. Always tired, always stressed about money. Do you know what it's like to be 8 years old and have to wake up your father because he fell asleep at the kitchen table again? Do you know what it's like to explain to your friends why your dad can't come to the father-daughter dance because he's pulling a double shift? Each word was a knife twisting in an old wound. I was trying to provide for us. Your mother's medical bills, the mortgage, your school supplies. Harold would have helped. He offered to help, remember? But your pride was more important than my needs. My hands started shaking. Harold had indeed offered help when we first met him. Offered to pay for Paula's college, to help with the house payments. But something about the man had set off every alarm bell in my head. The way he looked at the family photos on our mantel, the questions he asked about my late wife Sarah, the way he seemed to know things about our family that I'd never told him. I wanted to take care of my own family, I said quietly. Paula laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Your own family? When was the last time we had dinner together, Dad? When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Harold calls me 3 times a week. He knows about my promotion at work. He knows about the house Christian and I are buying. He even knows what flowers I wanted for the wedding. You know none of that. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. We'd grown apart over the years, our conversations becoming stilted and brief. But I'd always assumed that was normal, that adult children naturally became independent. I never realized how much distance had grown between us until this moment. I love you, Paula. Everything I've done has been for you. No, Dad. Everything you've done has been about your guilt over Mom dying. You worked yourself to death trying to make up for something that wasn't your fault, and in the process, you forgot you still had a daughter who needed you. The mention of Sarah made my chest tighten. Even after 13 years, the pain of losing her was still sharp enough to cut. Paula was right about one thing. I had carried that guilt like a weight around my neck. If only I'd noticed Sarah's symptoms sooner, if only I'd insisted she see a doctor earlier, if only I'd been a better husband. Your mother's death wasn't anyone's fault, I managed to say. Paula's expression softened for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when she had nightmares. But then, the hardness returned. Maybe not, but the way you handled it was your choice. You chose work over me. You chose guilt over healing. And now you're choosing pride over accepting that Harold has been the father figure I needed. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to make her understand. But looking at her face, I realized the battle was already lost. Somehow, without me noticing, I'd lost my daughter to a man who'd known her for 3 years compared to my 32. "Please don't do this," I whispered. "I know I made mistakes, but I'm still your father." Paula picked up her phone and started typing. Christian's picking up his tux from the rental place. Harold's handling the final details with the caterer. Mom's wedding ring has been resized for me. Harold took care of that too. There's nothing you need to do, Dad. There's nothing you can do that hasn't already been done better by someone else. The dismissal was complete. I wasn't just uninvited to her wedding, I was being erased from it entirely. Even Sarah's ring, the one I'd saved from her jewelry box all these years, had been handed over to Harold to manage. I stood up on unsteady legs. "I raised you, Paula. After your mother died, it was just you and me against the world. Doesn't that count for anything?" For a moment, her composure cracked. "That's exactly the problem, Dad. It shouldn't have been us against the world. It should have been us building a life together. But you were so busy fighting battles that didn't need to be fought, you forgot to actually live." I walked toward the door, each step feeling like I was walking away from my life. At the threshold, I turned back. "I'll always love you, sweetheart. No matter what happens tomorrow, no matter how angry you are with me, I'll always be your father." Paula didn't respond. She'd already turned back to her flowers, dismissing me as if I were a delivery man who'd finished his job. Driving home through the familiar streets of our small town, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation. Had I really been such a terrible father? Yes, I'd worked long hours, but it was necessary. Yes, I'd been tired and stressed, but I was keeping us housed and fed. Yes, I'd turned down Harold's help, but something about that man had never felt right to me. As I pulled into my empty driveway, I made a decision. Paula might not want me at her wedding, but I was going to be there anyway. Hidden in the back, watching from the shadows if necessary. She was still my daughter, and this was still the most important day of her life. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a mistake trusting Harold so completely. And tomorrow, whether she wanted me there or not, I was going to find out why my instincts about that man had always screamed danger. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my recliner staring at the photo albums spread across my coffee table, forcing myself to relive 13 years of single parenthood. Every school play, every birthday party, every scraped knee and broken heart, it was all there, documented in faded photographs that now felt like evidence in a trial where I was both defendant and jury. Paula at 9, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a science fair ribbon. I remembered that day clearly. I'd taken my first sick day in 2 years just to be there, despite having the flu and a fever of 102 degrees. She'd hugged me so tight afterward, not caring that I might make her sick too. Paula at 12, awkward in her first formal dress for the school dance. I'd spent 3 hours learning how to braid her hair from YouTube videos because we couldn't afford a salon. She'd complained the entire time that I was pulling too hard, but when her friends complimented her hair that night, she'd called me proudly to tell me. Paula at 16, crying in my arms after her first heartbreak. Tommy Morrison had asked another girl to prom and she'd been devastated. I'd held her while she sobbed, feeling helpless and furious at the boy who'd hurt my daughter. We'd stayed up until 3 in the morning eating ice cream and watching old movies. When had those moments stopped? When had the hugs become brief and obligatory? When had our conversations become limited to logistics and weather reports? The answer came to me with painful clarity. 3 years ago, when Harold entered our lives. I closed the photo album and picked up my phone. Against my better judgment, I scrolled through Paula's social media, something I rarely did. Her feed was filled with pictures from the past few months, engagement photos, wedding planning, happy couple shots with Christian, and in so many of them, there was Harold. Harold walking Paula through venue options, Harold at the cake tasting, Harold giving a toast at the engagement party I hadn't been invited to. In every single photo, Harold looked like the proud father, and I was nowhere to be seen. I set the phone down and walked to the kitchen, needing coffee even though it was 2 in the morning. The house felt enormous and empty around me. It was the same house where Sarah and I had brought Paula home from the hospital, where she'd taken her first steps, where we'd been a family. The memories of those early days after Sarah's death came flooding back, and I let them. Maybe Paula was right. Maybe I needed to face what I'd done wrong. Sarah had been sick for 8 months before she died. Breast cancer that spread faster than anyone anticipated. I'd taken family leave from my job at the manufacturing plant, burning through our savings and going into debt to be with her during treatments. When she passed away, I was left with a 19-year-old daughter starting college, medical bills that totaled over $200,000, and a grief so overwhelming I could barely function. I did what I thought was best. I went back to work and picked up every extra shift available. Weekends, holidays, overtime whenever I could get it. I told myself I was being responsible, providing for Paula's future. The truth was, work was easier than being home with the constant reminders of what I'd lost. Paula had been away at college then, and our phone calls became shorter and more infrequent. She was busy with her new life, and I convinced myself that was healthy. When she graduated and moved back to town for her job at the bank, I'd assumed we'd naturally become closer again. But by then, the pattern was set. I was the workaholic father who showed love through providing rather than presence. She was the independent young woman who'd learned not to need me. Enter Harold. I'd first met him at Paula's birthday dinner 2 years ago. She'd been dating Christian for about 6 months, and this was my introduction to his family. Harold was everything I wasn't: wealthy, polished, charming. He owned a successful real estate development company and drove a car that cost more than I made in a year. But it wasn't his money that bothered me. It was the way he looked at Paula, like he was studying her. The way he asked detailed questions about her childhood, her relationship with her mother, her memories of our family life. At first, I thought he was just being a caring, potential father-in-law. But something felt off. "So Paula tells me you worked at Morrison Manufacturing for 30 years, he'd said during dinner, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. That must have been tough after Sarah passed away, working all those double shifts. I'd been surprised he knew about the double shifts. Paula and I rarely discuss the specifics of that difficult period. A man does what he has to do to provide for his family, I'd replied. Harold had nodded sympathetically. Of course, though I imagine it was hard on Paula, having you gone so much during such a difficult time. She was what, 19 when Sarah died? Still needing her father. The comment had stung because it held truth, but the way he'd said it felt calculated, like he was planting a seed. Over the months that followed, I began to notice a pattern. Harold would make casual references to my shortcomings as a father, always framed as understanding or sympathy. He'd mention how Paula had told him about missing her high school graduation because of work, how she'd spent Christmas alone during her junior year of college because I'd picked up holiday shifts, how she'd had to figure out things like car insurance and apartment hunting without guidance because I was always too busy or too tired. Each comment was a small cut, made worse by the fact that they were true. But Harold didn't just highlight my failures, he positioned himself as the solution. He started inviting Paula to family dinners when Christian was out of town. He offered business advice when she was considering a job change. He remembered her birthday when I forgot it, due to working a particularly brutal week. Slowly, systematically, he became the father figure she'd been missing, while making sure I understood exactly how I'd failed to fill that role. The worst part was that Paula didn't seem to realize what was happening. To her, Harold was simply a kind man who cared about her well-being. She couldn't see the subtle manipulation, the way he was driving a wedge between us while positioning himself as her savior. I'd tried to talk to her about it once, about 6 months ago. "Don't you think Harold pays a lot of attention to our family history?" I'd asked carefully during one of our rare dinners together. "He's interested because he cares about me," she'd replied, immediately defensive. "It's called being a good father-in-law. But some of the things he mentions about your childhood, about your mother, I don't remember you sharing those details with Christian." Paula's face had hardened. "Maybe if you'd been around more, you'd remember what I shared and what I didn't." And maybe if you made an effort to get to know Christian's family instead of being suspicious of everyone who tries to care about me, you'd understand that Harold is just a good man. That conversation had ended badly, with Paula accusing me of being paranoid and jealous. We'd barely spoken since then, until yesterday's devastating confrontation. Now, sitting in my dark kitchen at 2:30 in the morning, I wondered if I'd been wrong about everything. Maybe Harold really was just a caring man, and my instincts were clouded by jealousy and regret. Maybe I really had been such a poor father that my daughter preferred a virtual stranger to me. But even as I tried to convince myself of this, something deep in my gut refused to accept it. There was something about Harold that didn't add up, something that went beyond his interest in Paula's well-being. I'd spent 30 years working in manufacturing, and you develop an instinct for when something's not built right, when the pieces don't fit together the way they should. Harold felt like a machine with a hidden flaw, one that would only become apparent when it was too late to fix. As dawn broke over the small town where I'd raised my daughter alone, I made a decision. Even if Paula didn't want me at her wedding, even if I had to watch from the parking lot, I was going to be there. Because whatever Harold's game was, I had a feeling it was about to reach its endgame. And I wasn't going to let him destroy what was left of my family without a fight. The morning of Paula's wedding arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly. I'd barely slept, my mind churning with fragments of memories and in growing sense that something was terribly wrong. By 7 a.m. I was dressed in my only good suit, the same one I'd worn to Sarah's funeral 13 years ago, and driving toward the church despite having no invitation. I parked 3 blocks away and walked, keeping my head down as I passed other early arrivals. The St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Sarah and I had been married 24 years ago, was buzzing with activity. Florists were making final arrangements, photographers were testing their equipment, and caterers were setting up tables in the adjacent hall. I slipped around to the back of the building, where I knew there was a small garden area with stone benches. From there, I could see the side entrance that the wedding party would use. It wasn't much, but at least I'd be able to catch a glimpse of my daughter on her wedding day. What I didn't expect was to overhear a conversation that would change everything. I'd been sitting on the bench for maybe 20 minutes when I heard voices coming from the open window of what I knew was the church office. The window was about 10 feet above me, and the voices were clear in the still morning air. "Everything needs to be perfect today," a man was saying. I recognized Harold's voice immediately. "This has been 3 years in the making." "I still don't understand why you're so invested in this girl," another male voice replied, older, gravelly. "You've got your own son to worry about." Harold laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Marcus, you never did understand the big picture. This isn't about Christian. It's about making things right." Making things right how? There was a pause, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear every word. "Sarah Hendricks was supposed to be my wife," Harold said finally. "We were engaged. Did you know that? 1978. I'd bought the ring, planned the proposal, had everything set up. Then she met George at that stupid church picnic, and everything changed." My blood ran cold. Sarah had never mentioned being engaged to anyone before me. She told me about previous boyfriends, but never an engagement. "Harold, that was over 40 years ago," Marcus said. "What does that have to do with—" "She left me a note," Harold continued, his voice hardening. "Said she'd found someone who understood her better, someone who shared her values. George Hendricks, the factory worker who went to church every Sunday and probably never had an impure thought in his life. She chose him over me." The pieces started falling into place in my mind, creating a picture so disturbing I wanted to reject it entirely. "So you what? Spent 4 decades nursing a grudge?" Marcus sounded incredulous. "I moved on," Harold said sharply. "Built a business, married Christian's mother, had a life. But when I heard Sarah had died and that George was struggling to raise Paula alone, well, it seemed like an opportunity to right an old wrong. By stealing his daughter? By giving her the father she deserved, the father I would have been if Sarah had made the right choice 40 years ago. I felt sick to my stomach. All this time, I'd sensed something off about Harold's interest in Paula, but I'd never imagined it was rooted in a decades-old obsession with my dead wife. "You're talking about manipulating a grieving child," Marcus said, and I could hear the disapproval in his voice. "I'm talking about justice," Harold replied coldly. "George got Sarah, got the life that should have been mine. His daughter deserves better than what he can provide. I've given Paula stability, guidance, opportunities, things her biological father was too selfish or too stupid to offer. And what happens now? You've successfully alienated her from her father. Christian's marrying her today. Mission accomplished?" Harold's laugh sent chills down my spine. "Today is just the beginning, Marcus. Paula doesn't know it yet, but she's inherited some property from Sarah's side of the family, a trust that becomes available when she marries. About $800,000, plus some land up in the mountains that's worth at least another $300,000. My heart stopped. I knew nothing about any inheritance. Sarah had been estranged from her family since we'd married. They disapproved of her marrying beneath her social class. I'd assumed there was nothing left when they died. Jesus, Harold? This is about money? It's about everything, Harold snapped. The money, the property, the satisfaction of knowing that George Hendricks lost his wife, and now he's lost his daughter too. Sarah chose wrong 40 years ago, but her daughter chose right. How does Paula not know about this inheritance? Because the family lawyers have been instructed to contact Christian after the marriage. As her husband, he'll be informed of her assets, and Christian, being the good son he is, will make sure his father has access to those resources. I gripped the edge of the stone bench so hard my knuckles turned white. This wasn't just about Harold's twisted need for revenge against a woman who'd been dead for 13 years. This was about money, about manipulation, about using my daughter as a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. "You've been planning this for 3 years," Marcus said slowly. "Getting close to her, turning her against her father, making sure your son was the perfect boyfriend." "Christian doesn't know the full scope of it," Harold admitted. "He genuinely cares for Paula, which makes it easier. But yes, I've been very careful about nurturing their relationship. Paula needed to feel loved, valued, appreciated, things her father never provided. The casual way he dismissed my love for Paula, the way he reduced 13 years of single parenthood to a series of failures, made my hands shake with rage. This is sick, Harold. This girl has done nothing to you. She's Sarah's daughter. That's enough." There was movement inside the office, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. "I need to go check on the flowers," Harold said. "The ceremony starts in 3 hours and everything needs to be perfect. Today, George Hendricks loses the last piece of Sarah he has left." I sat frozen on that bench for another 10 minutes after they left, my mind reeling. Everything made sense now. Harold's intense interest in our family history, his systematic campaign to undermine my relationship with Paula, his insistence on handling all the wedding details. He wasn't just playing the role of loving father-in-law, he was orchestrating the complete destruction of my relationship with my daughter while positioning himself to control her inheritance. But the most disturbing part was Paula's trust in him. She had no idea that the man she viewed as a father figure was using her to settle a 40-year-old grudge against her dead mother. She thought Harold loved her for who she was, not as a tool for revenge against me. I pulled out my phone and started typing a text to Paula, then stopped. What would I say? That her beloved Harold was a manipulative sociopath who'd been playing a long game of revenge? She'd never believe me. After yesterday's confrontation, she'd assume I was making up lies to ruin her wedding day. But I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let Harold steal my daughter's inheritance and her future, even if she currently hated me. Whatever mistakes I'd made as a father, whatever shortcomings had driven us apart, Paula deserved to know the truth about the man she trusted. The question was how to expose Harold without destroying Paula in the process. She was about to marry his son in 3 hours, surrounded by friends and family, believing she was choosing love over the disappointment of her relationship with me. I stood up from the bench, my legs unsteady, and looked toward the church. Somewhere inside, Paula was probably getting ready, excited about her future, trusting in the man who'd promised to be the father I'd never been. She had no idea that, in 3 hours, she'd be walking into a trap that had been 40 years in the making. and I might be the only person who could save her from it. I had 2.5 hours to figure out how to save my daughter from a man who'd spent 3 years systematically destroying our relationship. The weight of what I'd overheard pressed down on me like a physical burden as I walked back to my car, my mind racing through possibilities. I could confront Harold directly, but he'd deny everything. I could try to talk to Paula again, but after yesterday, she wouldn't listen to a word I said about Harold. I could try to reach Christian, but he was Harold's son. Would he believe his father capable of such manipulation? Then it hit me. I needed proof, and I knew exactly where to find it. Driving home, I remembered something Sarah had told me early in our marriage. She'd mentioned keeping a hope chest in her bedroom as a young woman, filled with letters and mementos from her dating years. After we married, she'd packed it away in our attic, saying she wanted to keep it for Paula someday. After Sarah died, I'd never had the heart to go through her personal things. The hope chest was still up there, covered in dust and 13 years of grief. If Harold was telling the truth about being engaged to Sarah, there might be evidence in that chest. I pulled down the attic ladder with shaking hands and climbed up into the stifling space. The chest sat exactly where Sarah had left it, a cedar box with brass hinges that had belonged to her grandmother. My heart hammered as I lifted the lid. Inside were layers of tissue paper, protecting photographs, letters, and small keepsakes. As I carefully went through the contents, a picture emerged of Sarah's life before me, a life I'd never fully understood. There were letters from college friends, programs from school plays, dried flowers from proms. And then, near the bottom, I found what I was looking for: a small velvet ring box and a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. My hands trembled as I opened the ring box. Inside was an engagement ring, not elaborate, but clearly expensive for a young man in 1978. The letters were all signed H and dated from that same year. With growing dread, I read through them. They told the story of a young couple planning their future together. Harold had been 24 to Sarah's 22, already showing the ambition that would later make him wealthy. The letters were passionate, possessive, and increasingly demanding. "My darling Sarah," one letter read, "I've been thinking about our wedding, and I believe it would be best if we move to Chicago after we're married. My business opportunities are better there, and frankly, I think you'd benefit from some distance from your family. They don't understand your potential the way I do." Another letter, dated just weeks later, "I'm concerned about the time you're spending at that church. I know faith is important to you, but some of those people are filling your head with ideas that aren't compatible with the life we're building. When we're married, I'll help you find a more suitable congregation." The final letter in the stack was dated just 3 days before Sarah and I met. "Sarah, your behavior at dinner last night was unacceptable. Questioning my business decisions in front of my colleagues showed a lack of respect that I won't tolerate for my future wife. We need to discuss your role in our marriage and establish some boundaries. I'll pick you up at 7 tonight, and we're going to settle this once and for all." At the bottom of the chest, I found Sarah's response, a letter she'd apparently written but never sent, dated the day after we met. "Harold," it began in her familiar handwriting, "I can't marry you. I know this will come as a shock, but I've met someone who makes me feel like myself, instead of a project to be improved. George sees me as I am and loves me anyway, flaws and all. You see me as I could be if I just changed everything about myself. That's not love, Harold. That's control. I'm returning your ring with this letter. Please don't contact me again. I wish you happiness, but it won't be with me, Sarah." I sat back on my heels, the letter shaking in my hands. This painted a completely different picture than the one Harold had shared with his friend Marcus. Sarah hadn't just chosen me over him, she'd run from him. The engagement hadn't been the loving relationship he'd described. It had been controlling and manipulative, but there was more. Tucked behind the letters was a legal document I'd never seen before. It was a copy of a trust agreement dated 6 months before Sarah died. According to the paperwork, Sarah's estranged grandfather had left her a substantial inheritance, exactly as Harold had described. Land in the mountains worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, plus investments that had grown over the years. The trust specified that the inheritance would pass to Sarah's children when they married, with notification going to both the beneficiary and their spouse. But there was a crucial detail Harold had omitted in his conversation. The trust required that both parents be notified of the inheritance, regardless of their marital status. I was supposed to have been contacted years ago when Paula turned 25, and again when she got engaged. The fact that I'd never heard anything meant someone had been intercepting the communications. With growing horror, I read through the trustee information. The original trustee had been Sarah's family lawyer, but 3 years ago, right when Harold entered our lives, the trust had been transferred to a new firm, a firm owned by Harold's business partner. This was bigger than I'd imagined. Harold hadn't just been manipulating Paula's emotions and our relationship. He'd been manipulating the legal system, positioning himself to control her inheritance by ensuring I never knew it existed. I gathered all the evidence and stuffed it into a folder, my mind reeling. Paula was supposed to walk down the aisle in less than 2 hours, believing she was marrying for love while being maneuvered into a trap that had been 40 years in the making. But I still faced the same problem: how to convince Paula of the truth when she'd already decided I was the villain in her story. Then I remembered Father McKenna. He'd been the priest at St. Mary's for 30 years, had married Sarah and me, baptized Paula, buried Sarah. He'd known our family through all our joys and struggles. More importantly, he'd known Sarah before Harold, before me. If anyone could verify the truth about Sarah's first engagement and help me figure out how to protect Paula, it would be him. I called the church, praying he'd answer. St. Mary's, Father McKenna speaking. Father, it's George Hendricks. I need to talk to you urgently about Paula's wedding, about Harold Morrison, and something that happened 40 years ago. There was a pause. George, I was wondering when you'd figure it out. I've been waiting for this call for 3 years. My heart stopped. You knew? I knew Harold before he knew Sarah. I was a young seminarian then, working at St. Michael's across town. Harold used to attend services there when he was courting Sarah. I remember him well, charming on the surface, but there was something about him that troubled me. When Sarah came to me before breaking their engagement, she was frightened. Frightened? Harold had become increasingly controlling, increasingly angry when she expressed any independence. The final straw was when he told her she'd need to cut ties with her family after they married because they were holding her back. Sarah realized she wasn't entering a marriage. She was entering a cage. Father McKenna paused, and I could hear him moving around, probably closing his office door. George, when Harold showed up 3 years ago as Christian's father, I recognized him immediately. I've been watching, waiting, hoping I was wrong about his intentions. But the way he's systematically alienated Paula from you, the way he's inserted himself into every aspect of her life, it's the same pattern he showed with Sarah 40 years ago. Father, there's something else. An inheritance Sarah never told me about. Harold's been manipulating the trust, positioning himself to control it through Christian. Dear God, Father McKenna whispered, George, you need to get over here right now and bring whatever evidence you have. If Harold is planning what I think he's planning, we need to stop this wedding before Paula makes the biggest mistake of her life. I was already in my car, driving toward the church with a folder full of secrets that could destroy my daughter's faith in everyone she trusted. But if I didn't act, Harold would succeed in his 40-year campaign of revenge, and Paula would spend her life as a pawn in a game she never knew she was playing. The truth was about to come out, and it was going to shatter everything Paula believed about her life, her choices, and the man she'd trusted to be her father. Father McKenna was waiting for me in his office when I arrived, his weathered face grave with concern. I'd known him for over 20 years, and I'd never seen him look so troubled. Show me what you found, he said without preamble. I spread the contents of Sarah's hope chest across his desk, the letters, the engagement ring, the trust documents, and most damning of all, Sarah's unsent letter breaking off the engagement. Father McKenna examined each item carefully, his expression growing darker with each revelation. This is worse than I feared, he said finally. George, Harold isn't just manipulating Paula's emotions. He's been systematically defrauding her inheritance for 3 years. Look at these trust transfer documents. He pointed to a signature line I hadn't noticed before. This shows that the trust was transferred to Harold's business partner's firm, but the signature authorizing the transfer is supposedly Paula's. She would have been 29 when this was signed. I leaned closer, studying the signature. It looked like Paula's handwriting, but something felt off about it. "I don't think Paula ever signed this," I said slowly. "She would have told me about inheriting money from her mother's family, especially when we were struggling with bills." "I think you're right," Father McKenna said grimly, "and I think I know how Harold managed it. 3 years ago when Paula first started dating Christian, do you remember her mentioning signing some paperwork?" I searched my memory. Then it came back to me. She said Christian's father was helping her with some insurance forms for her apartment. Something about making sure she had adequate coverage. "I'll bet those weren't insurance forms." Father McKenna gathered the documents. "George, we need to stop this wedding. But we need to do it carefully. If we simply accuse Harold without absolute proof, Paula will think we're trying to sabotage her happiness out of spite. What do you suggest?" Father McKenna was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at me with determination. "I'm going to stop the ceremony. During the wedding vows, I'm going to ask if anyone has just cause why these two should not be wed. And then I'm going to present the evidence." My stomach clenched. "That will destroy Paula in front of all her friends, her co-workers, everyone she knows. George, if we don't stop this now, Harold will have legal access to her inheritance through Christian. He'll have succeeded in stealing both your daughter and her future. Sometimes the truth has to hurt before it can heal." I knew he was right, but the thought of Paula's humiliation, her shock, her devastation, made me feel sick. "There's something else," Father McKenna continued. "I called my friend Father Rodriguez at St. Michael's, where Harold used to attend. He still has records from that time period. Harold was investigated by the police in 1979 for harassment after Sarah broke their engagement." "What kind of harassment?" "Phone calls at all hours, following her to work, showing up at her apartment uninvited. Sarah had to get a restraining order. Harold left town shortly after that, and the harassment stopped. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture of a man who'd never gotten over being rejected, who'd spent 40 years nursing his obsession." "There's more," Father McKenna said grimly. Father Rodriguez remembered something else. After Harold left town, there were questions about some missing funds from the church building fund. Nothing was ever proven, but the timing was suspicious. I stared at him. "You think he's been doing this his whole life? Manipulating people? Taking what he thinks he deserves?" "I think Harold Morrison is a dangerous man who's very good at appearing normal. And I think your daughter is in serious trouble." Through the office window, I could see wedding guests starting to arrive. Cars were filling the parking lot, people in their best clothes walking toward the church entrance, all of them expecting to witness a joyful celebration. "How do we do this?" I asked, my voice rough with emotion. "You need to be in the church when it happens," Father McKenna said. "Paula will need you when this all comes out. She'll be devastated, confused, probably angry at everyone, but when the shock wears off, she'll need her father. What if she doesn't want me there? What if she blames me for ruining her wedding?" Father McKenna put a hand on my shoulder. "George, you've spent 3 years watching Harold steal your daughter's affection through manipulation and lies. Today, you have the chance to save her from a lifetime of being controlled by a man who sees her as property. Whatever happens, whatever she says in the moment, you'll know you did the right thing." I nodded, trying to steady my nerves. Through the window, I could see Harold directing the wedding photographer, playing his role as the caring father figure to perfection. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, looking every inch the successful businessman who'd graciously welcomed his son's bride into the family. No one looking at him would suspect he was capable of the systematic manipulation I'd uncovered. That's what made him so dangerous. "I should go," I said, gathering my courage. "I want to be seated before Paula arrives." "George," Father McKenna called as I reached the door, "whatever happens in there, remember that you're fighting for your daughter's future. Harold has had 3 years to poison her against you. Today, the truth comes out. I walked into the church through the main entrance, keeping my head down as I found a seat in the back row. The sanctuary was filling with guests, Paula's co-workers from the bank, college friends, neighbors who'd watched her grow up. Many of them nodded politely when they saw me, probably assuming the rift with Paula had been resolved for the wedding. If only they knew what was about to happen. Christian stood at the altar with his groomsmen, looking nervous but happy. He kept checking his watch and smoothing his tie. For a moment, I felt sorry for him. As far as I could tell, he genuinely loved Paula and had no idea his father was using their relationship for revenge. Harold sat in the front row, perfectly composed, occasionally turning to smile at guests as they took their seats. He looked like any proud father-in-law basking in the joy of the occasion. The performance was flawless. The organ began playing the processional, and everyone stood as the wedding party began their march down the aisle. Paula's bridesmaids came first, glowing in their pale blue dresses, followed by the maid of honor, Paula's best friend from college. And then Paula appeared at the back of the church. My breath caught in my throat. She looked beautiful, radiant in Sarah's wedding dress that had been altered to fit her perfectly. Harold walked beside her, his arm linked through hers, playing the role of the father giving away his daughter. The sight of him escorting my daughter down the aisle, of him standing in the place that should have been mine, filled me with a rage so intense I had to grip the pew to keep from standing up and shouting. But this wasn't about my hurt feelings. This was about saving Paula from a man who had been manipulating her life for 3 years, positioning himself to control her future and her inheritance. As they reached the altar, Harold kissed Paula's cheek and shook Christian's hand before taking his seat in the front row. Paula looked radiant, completely trusting, utterly unaware that the man she'd chosen as her surrogate father was about to be exposed as a fraud. Father McKenna began the ceremony, his voice steady despite the bombshell he was about to drop. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Paula and Christian in holy matrimony. I watched Paula's face, seeing her happiness, her love for Christian, her complete faith in the future they were building together. In a few minutes, all of that would be shattered. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, Father McKenna continued, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. He paused, his eyes scanning the congregation before settling on Harold. If anyone can show just cause why they may not lawfully be married, speak now or forever hold your peace. The church fell silent. This was the moment. Father McKenna took a deep breath. I cannot, in good conscience, perform this ceremony until certain truths are brought to light. The silence that followed Father McKenna's words was deafening. Paula stared at him in confusion, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Christian looked bewildered, glancing between his bride and the priest. But it was Harold's face that confirmed everything. The mask slipped for just a moment, revealing cold fury before he composed himself again. Father McKenna, Harold said smoothly, rising from his seat, surely this isn't the time for— Sit down, Harold, Father McKenna said firmly, or should I say Harold Morrison, the same Harold Morrison who was engaged to Sarah Hendricks 40 years ago. A collective gasp rippled through the church. Paula's face went white as she looked between Father McKenna and Harold, confusion and dawning horror in her eyes. What are you talking about? Paula whispered. Father McKenna stepped down from the altar, the folder of evidence in his hands. Paula, your father discovered something this morning that you need to know. Harold Morrison was engaged to your mother before she met your father. When she broke the engagement to marry George, Harold never forgave her. And for the past 3 years, he's been using you to get revenge. That's ridiculous, Harold snapped, but his voice had lost its confident tone. This is obviously some desperate attempt by George to ruin his daughter's happiness because he can't stand being replaced. Paula turned to look at me for the first time, her eyes full of pain and confusion. Dad, what is this about? I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. Every eye in the church was on me as I walked down the aisle toward my daughter. Paula, I said softly, I found your mother's hope chest this morning, the one she kept in our attic. There are letters in there from Harold from when they were engaged, and there's a letter your mother wrote but never sent. explaining why she couldn't marry him. Father McKenna opened the folder and pulled out Sarah's unsent letter. Harold, your mother wrote this the day after she met your father. She said you saw her as a project to be improved, not a person to be loved. She was afraid of you? This is insane, Christian said, stepping protectively closer to Paula. Dad, tell them this isn't true. But Harold's composure was cracking. The genial father figure was disappearing, replaced by something much darker. Sarah made her choice, Harold said, his voice turning bitter. She chose a factory worker over a man who could have given her everything. She chose poverty over prosperity, struggle over success. She chose love over control, I said, finding my voice. And you never forgave her for it. Paula sank onto the altar steps, her wedding dress pooling around her. I don't understand. Why would you? If you loved my mother, why would you hurt me? Harold's mask finally fell away completely. Because you're her daughter. Because every time I look at you, I see what I lost. I gave you everything your father couldn't. Stability, opportunities, guidance. I became the father he failed to be by lying to her, Father McKenna interjected, by manipulating her emotions, turning her against her real father, and stealing her inheritance. At the word inheritance, Paula's head snapped up. What inheritance? Father McKenna pulled out the trust documents. Your mother's grandfather left her a substantial inheritance, land and investments worth over $1 million. It was supposed to pass to you when you married, with both your parents being notified. Harold has been intercepting those communications for 3 years, positioning himself to control the money through Christian. Paula looked at the documents with growing horror. I never signed anything about a trust. But you signed insurance papers that Harold's business partner prepared, I said gently. 3 years ago, when you first started dating Christian, I think those weren't insurance forms. The color drained from Christian's face as he stared at his father. Dad, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you didn't manipulate my relationship with Paula for money. Harold looked around the church at all the shocked faces, at his carefully constructed world falling apart, and something inside him snapped. She was mine first, he shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Sarah was supposed to be my wife. We had plans, a future. Then she threw it all away for him. He pointed at me with pure hatred. A nobody who worked with his hands and never had an original thought in his life. Paula stood up slowly, her legs shaking. You've been using me to hurt my father. Everything you've done for me, every kindness, every piece of advice. It was all part of some sick revenge plot. I gave you everything he couldn't, Harold insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. I gave you the father you deserved. You gave me lies, Paula said, her voice breaking. You turned me against my real father, made me believe he didn't care about me, all so you could steal my mother's money and hurt him. The truth was out now, ugly and devastating. Guests were murmuring to each other. Some people were crying, others looked angry. Christian stood frozen, staring at his father like he'd never seen him before. Christian, Paula said softly, turning to face him. Did you know? Christian's face was anguished. I swear to you, Paula, I had no idea. I thought Dad just cared about you because he saw how happy you made me. I never knew about any of this. But how can I trust that? Paula asked, tears streaming down her face. How can I marry into a family where the father has been manipulating me for 3 years? How do I know what's real anymore? It was then that I stepped forward, my heart breaking for my daughter's pain. Paula, I said gently, I know you're hurt and confused right now. I know you don't trust me, and I understand why. But I need you to know that everything I did, every choice I made after your mother died, was because I loved you. I worked those double shifts to pay for your college, to keep our house, to make sure you had a future. I was tired, yes. I was often absent when you needed me, but it was never because I didn't care. Paula looked at me with eyes full of pain and uncertainty. But Harold was right about some things. You weren't there for me emotionally. You didn't know what was happening in my life. You're right, I admitted. I failed you in important ways. I was so focused on providing for you that I forgot you needed a father, not just a provider. I was drowning in grief and guilt, and I let that affect my parenting. But Paula, I never stopped loving you, and I never would have used you to hurt someone else. Harold made a sound of disgust. This is touching, but it doesn't change the facts. George was an absent father, and I stepped in to fill that void. By lying and manipulating, Christian said, his voice hollow with shock and disappointment. Dad, how could you do this to someone I love? Because she deserved better than what she got, Harold snapped. Look at her. Beautiful, intelligent, successful. She could have had everything, but George's limitations held her back. My father's limitations, Paula said, her voice rising. My father worked himself to exhaustion to give me opportunities. He went into debt to pay for my education. He sacrificed his own happiness to make sure I had a future. And you've spent 3 years convincing me he didn't care? For the first time in years, I saw my daughter truly seeing me, not through Harold's filter of criticism and manipulation, but with her own eyes. I'm so sorry, Dad, she whispered. And then she was running toward me, her wedding dress trailing behind her. I caught her in my arms, holding her, as she sobbed against my shoulder. 13 years of distance, 3 years of manipulation and moments of truth all crashed together as I held my daughter for the first time in longer than I could remember. I'm sorry too, sweetheart, I whispered into her hair. I should have fought harder for our relationship. I should have seen what Harold was doing. Over Paula's shoulder, I could see Harold being quietly escorted out by 2 police officers that Father McKenna must have called. His carefully constructed facade had completely crumbled, leaving behind a bitter old man whose obsession had finally destroyed him. Christian stood uncertainly nearby, clearly devastated by his father's betrayal, but unwilling to abandon Paula in her moment of crisis. Paula pulled back from our embrace and looked at him through her tears. Christian, I'm so sorry. This isn't your fault, but I can't get married today. I need time to figure out what's real and what was manipulation. Christian nodded sadly, but with understanding. I know. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready, if you still want me to be. The wedding that Harold had orchestrated as the culmination of his revenge had instead become the moment of his downfall and our redemption. 6 months later, Paula and Christian had a small, quiet ceremony in Father McKenna's garden behind the church. I walked my daughter down the aisle, not as a replacement father figure, but as her real father who'd found his way back to her heart. Harold was serving time for fraud and harassment. The inheritance money had been returned to Paula, who used part of it to help me pay off the mortgage on the house where she'd grown up. Paula and I still had work to do on our relationship. 3 years of poisonous lies don't disappear overnight, and I still had to prove daily that I could be the father she needed. But we were talking again, really talking, about the past and the future. The night before her real wedding, Paula came over for dinner, something we'd started doing every Sunday. Dad, she said, as we cleared the dishes, I need to ask you something. Anything, sweetheart. Do you think Mom would be proud of us for finding our way back to each other? I thought about Sarah, about her hope chest full of dreams and fears, about the letter she'd written to save herself from a man who wanted to control her rather than love her. I think, I said carefully, your mother would be proud that you had the courage to recognize the truth even when it was painful. And I think she'd be proud that we didn't let Harold's manipulation destroy what she left us, each other. Paula smiled through her tears and hugged me tight. I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. Always have, always will. Outside, the sun was setting over the small town where I'd raised my daughter alone, where I'd made mistakes, but never stopped loving her, where we'd both learned that family isn't about perfection, it's about forgiveness, truth, and the courage to keep trying. Harold had spent 40 years planning his revenge, but in the end, love had won. The bond between a father and daughter, tested by grief, manipulation, and time, had proven stronger than one man's bitter obsession. We were going to be okay.